Hello, hello. Welcome to another series that I'm kicking off that's going to be related to Hotwire and Ruby on Rails. And the focus here will be actually part of the Turbo and Stimulus frameworks that is a part of Hotwire.dev. So if you were to go to Hotwire.dev, you'll see kind of the overarching concepts and ideals behind this stuff. I've done a few like introductory videos of Turbo and whatnot, just to kind of get you familiar with how it works. But it's essentially another way to think about doing real-time updates for something like Rails, which is more server-side rendered app, as opposed to something more complicated and JavaScript enabled like React or Vue.js. So there's a lot you can do with this. And a lot of different concepts to kind of understand. But the idea here is mostly just following conventions like typical of Rails. So once you start to get the hang of it, it'll feel more familiar. But there is some stuff that's just like, wait, what am I doing here? And how does this work? But underneath the hood is actually some JavaScript doing this stuff for us. So you can kind of really eliminate the amount of JavaScript you need to write to get those updates you've longed for, I guess you could say. So what we'll be focusing on is mostly the Turbo stack and Stimulus, just little bits of that where we need to. Several videos of this series will come out, and we'll be focusing mostly on front end stuff. So like Modals is going to be the focus of this video, but other stuff related to typical UI components you might have in your app that need to have more interactivity. So instead of reaching for some sort of JavaScript engine or library or something of that nature, you can actually just kind of use what's built into the stack from default. So I'll run you through this really quick demo of modals, which is going to be the focus of today. And I'm going to create using just basically a blog post concept. Maybe for one reason or another, you wanted to make your content inside of a new modal window. You can actually do that. You click a new link and a modal fires. And we're kind of hijacking what would normally take JavaScript to render this and using HTML over the wire with Turbo and delivering that in the same view without actually redirecting anywhere. So it's kind of a neat little hack, but actually a performant one that doesn't require a bunch of downloading JavaScript and stuff behind the scenes. I did add some animations here, and I am using Tailwind CSS in this guide. So part of that is kind of making up this UI. And with Tailwind, I needed to extend it a little bit to add that animation you saw. So when you see it actually come into view, there's a slight delay and fade. And that's part of extending the Tailwind framework a bit. So that's stuff I haven't seen in other guides that I figured I'd add just to show you context of how you kind of hack that concept instead of just a flat view coming into your screen, which is with no animation whatsoever, which is kind of common with the Turbo field. It's hard to animate some of it. Let's do it just test post one. Test content, really simple concept here, just a model, a post model with a title and a content column. We'll create a post. It's actually going to go ahead and create it and go to the show view. I've created a few before, so the ID here is going to be pretty high. But the same is true of editing. You can do it and it'll go back into that modal. So it's just a really simple concept that accesses the new Turbo framework. And we didn't actually use any stimulus on this one to deliver that really real reactive feel. So it's pretty neat. And then yeah, that's essentially it. So I want to just walk you through how I went about that, the design of it, and then just little animated tips and tricks that I added just to give you some concepts of how you could take this and extend it in your own stack. So I'll create a new app, Rails new. I'll go to I had made a new directory on my computer that's just Hotwire based stuff. So I'll say Rails new Turbo modals demo. Then I'll say I'm going to use Tailwind, so I'll pass this -C option and pass Tailwind there. You could pass Bootstrap. I think Post CSS is another option there. Whatever you prefer. I'm using Tailwind on this simply because it's just really quick and easy to get going with. And then I prefer to use ES-Build, so I'll pass that as my JavaScript library. Rails defaults to import maps. Can't say I really like them that much. My computer hung up a little bit, so if there's a quick cut there, that's what happened. So I got this installed finally. We have a Rails app running, or it's not running, but I have it. And what I want to first do is open up the console or the code. I'll open up it instead of our old project. And inside, we want to add a few dependencies that we'll be using for Tailwind specifically. I want to add the forms plugin and also the typography one, just to give us some quick and easy wins with form styling. So I'll do a yarn add and then at Tailwind CSS/forms, and then I'm going to do a dash capital D that will save it as a dev dependency in our project instead of like an actual dependency that we'll need in production. That's just shown in your package.json file right here. So now these are dev dependencies, which we'll use, locally to build stuff. So that will be handy coming up. We're going to extend the config in a minute. I'll show you why. But yeah, essentially that's it as far as getting the dependencies in order. Next, I want to integrate the new scaffold of the post structure. So we need the concept of a post. So we'll say Rails generate scaffold post. Title will be string. You could just say, title if you want. And then content will be text. I mean, you could go balls to the wall here if you want to do something more. I'm just doing this for example purposes, so do what you want there. That will scaffold out the entire structure of a CRUD base app. So you got your new index, show, edit, and then you can delete as well. And that gives you a lot of garbage you don't need, but that's okay. We're just doing this for education. A brand new default Rails app won't have a root path, so let's go modify that. That's going to be in the routes file. If you just search for that in your code editor, you'll probably find it. So I'll say root to posts index. Great. And now we can boot the server. Since I installed CSS with Tailwind and also ES build, it's going to use a what's it called? A proc file behind the scenes to run a bin file that's what is it called? Dev. And it's going to use Foreman to go fetch those. Foreman's kind of a way to run multiple processes at once. So that's one way to do that in one command line instance, as opposed to opening up your new window and doing it in each. It just saves you some time. So instead of like Rails server here, which has been the thing you'd run for years, you can run bin dev, and that'll run Rails server, Turbo, or Tailwind CSS as a other process, and then the JavaScript process for ES build. So you're running three things at once there. And then I'll boot this up. We'll be able to go to posts, and also we need to run that migration. We'll just click the button here. Posts, you could do /post or just hit the root path. You'll see that it's ready to roll as post index there. So one quick housekeeping task I like to do is just get the application layout looking a little nicer. We'll maybe use some Tailwind here. I'll do a container that will be centered. So we'll do MX auto and add some padding on the sides, right and left side. Contain the yield statement, and then in the class field we'll say anti-aliased and text slate 700, a little less contrast overall. And then this could maybe have some margin offset. You're probably going to want to do something different there in terms of your actual layout, but that's something to take into account just for the demo here. Inside our index view, which is where a lot of the action will take place for getting Turbo set up. Turbo comes stock. So if you go into your Rails app gem file, you have a, where's it at? Turbo Rails gem that should come, ready to roll. And they give it a little quick one-liner, a spa-like app, single page app like page that just accelerates pages. If you come from old Rails, it's a new version of Turbo Links if you're used to that world, which used to be frowned upon, but I think has become more okay with for most people, simply because of the response time of stuff and being able to do things in real time. So I'm going to just make the heading here stand out a little bit. Text X3, we'll say font extra bold. There we go. And then the new post link, I'll add just an underline to make it more prominent. I'm not going to go crazy with design on this one, except for the modal part, just simply because we want to make it look like a modal. Okay, so here's the part where Turbo enters the scene, and we'll want to use a Turbo frame tag, which is a helper that comes with Rails Turbo or Turbo Rails gem. So we'll say Turbo frame tag, and we'll say, you can call this whatever. I'm going to call it a unique name that I'm giving it. So new post modal. And we need that as a way to wrap it in a frame. And we can view source to see what that really looks like. So the underlying library is going to go ahead and add that dynamically for us. That's not an actual HTML element, so it's just something that the library invents that does surround the content here. And then it's going to, I think the request concept of it based on the routing and whatnot will look for the file in the new file based on how this link is set up in the request cycle. And then go like look for this content to feed back into this area, essentially this frame in real time. So the idea is to send that HTML back over the wire, as they commonly say, and just embed it instead of having to redirect to that page, find the form, enter stuff into it, and do all those things just with redirect cycles, which is typically fine, but it can get old if you want more responsive applications. So enter Turbo for that reason. And then what we need to do, since this is here, we need a matching Turbo frame tag on the new view. And that's going to be responsible for defining what content gets delivered back into that Turbo frame tag based on the link that's here. So this is the trigger to go fetch that content in the same Turbo frame tag. So the new view is going to be a little more verbose since I want it to look like a modal. So some of this is coming from my new project Rails UI. I'll say that the demo or modal there is entirely stimulus.js, so it's not necessarily dependent on Turbo or the Hotwire concept. I think that's more server-side stuff that's going to be something I do later as opposed to being in the first phase of the UI library, whatever I'm calling it, Rails UI. You'd think I know that by now. But anyway. So you'll notice I'm surrounding everything in the Turbo frame tag, and that's intentional because I want all this to be what we render on the index path when we click that new post button. So right now this is just kind of the bare bones, but I want to add some content that makes it look like a modal. So I'll add a div, and it's going to surround everything, and I'm going to use a few accessibility enhancements. And inside that, we'll say aria. I think I'll use modal true, and we give this the class of fixed inset of 0, which will essentially mean all the top, left, right, and bottom all have 0 pixels as the positioning for fixed positioning, which means it stretches the full window of your browser. And then we'll have a high z index on this, so it becomes the highest thing on the page. We'll overflow the y-axis to auto, and I'll add a BG black color with some opacity, so you can do this slash command that's like at 80% opacity. And then I'll set a role on this to dialog, since that's what it would be. And inside there, we'll then screen, make the height all the way up, and width will be full, relative positioning, flex, item center, justify center. And inside of there, we'll have the actual modal. So this is what's going to be the content area. Everything else so far has been what's like positioning the modal in the center of the page and doing some fanciness with that. So it's in the center, also top and bottom center, left and right center, etc. So we'll add a pretty big shadow on this, give it a max width so it's not just the full width, and a background of white, margin, a little bit of that just all the way around, padding all that all the way around again with the 8. The pros class is what we've installed for Tailwind. I actually need to go still add those plugins to our configuration, so hopefully I don't forget that. Let's do teal and origin bottom, MX Auto. Now, if you want to set up dark mode, you could do that. It comes, stock with Tailwind. You just need to consider turning dark mode on. So I'll just go ahead and do it just to show you by example. It's arc text slate 200. We'll set a min width here, so we ensure there is, a set width of the modal, so it's not scrunched in the middle. And then we'll say rounded 2XL, and then we'll add this another class coming up that's going to be our animation that I'll show you that I was mentioning earlier. It's going to be less of a direct showing of the page and more of a faded effect that the modal, appears like you would expect a modal to appear. And then we'll say class dark for this one will be text slate 100 instead of the default. And that should be it as far as getting that set up. We do need to get the form styles going, so I'll do that real quick just to give you an example so it looks right. I like to go all out somewhat with design on these examples because I feel like if you omit that part, it's just not going to be the same and it's kind of hard to follow. So I know it's more tedious and more probably boring to watch, but to each his own, I guess. Full rounded. So I'm going to do this for one and then we'll copy it. Okay. So the Tailwind plugin ships with some default form styles. They're by no means completely awesome as far as looks, but they're ready to roll as far as getting it reset and presented as an input element, but it requires some more love, I think. So that's what I'm adding. I'm going to set a min height on the text area of 200 pixels so it spans a little higher. And below that we'll have our submit button. Just give it some styles too. So we'll say class rounded focus ring 4, focus ring teal 50, and then hover cursor pointer. All right. So additionally, with a modal, you can either have like a close icon or a cancel button, and I'm going to do the cancel button version. I mean, it's typical. You don't have to have it, but it's typical. Cancel. And honestly, this will just be a basic link. I'm going to just hijack it to say turbo false. So I'm sorry I'm moving fast there. I just want to get some good, decent styles going. So we'll actually flex these so they're in the opposite ends of the span of the modal when it's in view. So we'll say item center, and then the justify between is what will be pushing them between each other. Okay, and then for each form element, I just want to offset those a little bit with some margin. And finally, for this form in particular, I don't need it to be turbo. You could do something fancy and just make it all turbo, but I think the main goal is to get the modal to fire when you enter the new path. So that'll make more sense when we run through it here. So at this point, I want to go and install those plugins. We did install them already. We just need to declare them in our configuration. So I have Tailwind forms and typography set up. So we'll go and add another comma here after content, and we'll say plugins, and it'll be an array. And then inside there, you can say require, and then you'll just say at Tailwind when CSS. Look, it's auto completing for me, so that's great. And I'll just do it with typography as well. There are other plugins you can add or create your own. It's up to you. We'll come back here when we get into the animated part, which will be probably soon. So now if I click this, believe, we'll have everything working as such, and we're getting close to there we go. The elements are in place, the plugins are fired, so now it looks like a demo I showed you. And the cancel button will still take you back to the index. That could be more real time if you wanted it to be. You could do another turbo thing there. For now, I just bypassed it, and then with the flow. So here, the same with the form to actually create the post. So I'll just say test 1, Fast2. This should create it, and we'll be back to the post itself. Typical Rails fashion there. But if we were to go to edit, it's going to go back to the edit page. So that's one thing that's different in this case. You notice we don't have the turbo frame tag over here, nor the styles. So what I'll actually do, and what's quick and easy, is to copy that from the new page. And we could just keep the same, turbo frame tag. It's okay if it says new post modal. We probably should call it something else, but maybe I'll just rename it to post modal and do it here. And also on the end, new template. There we go. So I'll close that one. Edit's going to look like this. We'll just change it to edit. And you can keep the cancel button. I think it's not a big deal. I don't care for these links personally, so I didn't include them. So when we refresh that, it should go back into this mode now that we have the actual UI. The same cancel button works. If you go to new post, cancel, go show to this post, edit the post. I don't know, just update the post. There we go. Now that updated. Great. So everything's working. One little flair that I would love to add that is missing, in my opinion, is that little animation of a traditional modal. So like, see how fast that is? To me, that's lacking. So what we can do is more or less mimic that with what you would normally do with like JavaScript and CSS. So in this case, we are going to do it with CSS, but it's going to be relative to Tailwind. And the one thing I've learned is that the Tailwind has some base animation properties, and I predict they're going to come out with their own animation version of Tailwind soon, like an entire plugin probably. But for now, we have to kind of roll with our own. And you can do that by extending your theme in the configuration. So this is a little hairy to read probably, but just follow along. So I've got the theme object in this file, and then in that we'll extend it. And in that, there's a object called keyframes you can hook into, and then another one called animation. And we're going to be using both. So keyframes is where you declare the animations you will be using, and animation is where you declare the animation itself. So it's just like CSS, but in this case, we need to do it in JavaScript for Tailwind to recognize it. Now you could go write custom CSS in your style sheets and do the @apply statement, but I find this to be a little easier to understand and add to the stack. So what I want to add is a fade in up. So when you click on the new post modal, it's going to fade in, but also kind of upward. So it's you know modals, how they typically work. It's basically getting that flow going. So we'll declare the name of it, and we can set 2 properties. So, however many really, but we'll start at 0%. If you've ever written a CSS keyframe, you can go, from 0 to 100 in different keyframes if you want to go that crazy. Typically, you can kind of go with the flow, getting maybe 1, 2, or 3 keyframes in where you do different types of animations along the way. So in our case, we're going to say transform, and we'll say translate Y 10 pixels. It needs to be a capital Y there, and then parentheses 10 pixels. So this is actual CSS, it just happens to be in JavaScript. And then below that, we'll do the same, but I'm going to do it at 100% and change things up a little bit. So we'll say opacity 1. They need to be strings, the values, and we'll say transform will be translate Y. This will be 0. So that's back to the start. So it's starting from 10 pixels off the axis of Y and then going back to 0 in this case. Now you could extend that to be more if you want it, more of an animation of some type, but I kept it kind of minimal to be subtle. And then with that in place, you can define that keyframe animation you just set up. So we'll say animate, and it'll be called animation dash this. So in up, and I'll show you in a second. Then we'll declare it. So fade in up 0.3 seconds, and then I'll just say ease in out. Okay, so that sets up Tailwind to add a new animation property. So we've got a new class in our arsenal now. I'll go back to our new and edit. New. I will add it to, where did I add it? Was it on the whole thing? No, it was just the modal container. So we'll say animate dash fade in up. I'll add it to the edit page as well. So back there. Great. So with any luck, we'll be able to go and hit new post. And do you see that fade a little bit? Did it? Okay. And then I'll go check out, make sure edit does it as well. There we go. Now, if you wanted to adjust that, you totally could. Go to the Tailwind, change it to go slower if you want, and maybe more dramatic. And we can go back and refresh. Go back here. There you go. So something like that if you want it to go crazy. I like more quick animations, I would say. So maybe I'll even go down to 2. There we go. That's a little more abrupt. And we can go ahead and create another post. So next post. Create post. Great. Now what you want to do after that redirect or that create action, you could probably either hijack in your controller or even do another turbo frame tag inside that and adjust, what happens here. It responds to HTML after you create, so you could do another turbo stream perhaps and do something more dramatic there if you want to. To me, I kept it simple for now just so you can follow along and understand it. So modals are fairly simple with Turbo. To me, it depends on what your need. Sometimes, like I've done in the Rails UI side, I've added more of a customizable stimulus controller. So wherever in your view you are, you can add the content at ad hoc, as opposed to depending on all these different templates. So it's kind of a preference really. But all in all, you can do a lot with Turbo and Hotwire without needing much JavaScript at all, and it's pretty powerful. So hope this was helpful. We'll be coming back with more, and I'll see you in the next one.